Welcome to Midlife Matters. I'm Marie, and each week I'm joined by my friends Julie and Mindy to talk about all the topics keeping women in the middle years up at night. Today we're talking about how to strengthen and deepen friendships. Opening up and sharing ourselves with others is the key, but what are some good ways to do that? Our special guest Laura Tremaine has great advice and practical ways we can better connect with both new and old friends. Listeners, if you start talking to women, you find out a lot of women are lonely, even if they don't look like it on the outside. And coming off this year of isolation, I'm sure that even more of us are feeling lonely. So it seems like there's a high likelihood that some of you listeners might be struggling with reconnecting with old friends or making new ones. Mindy and Julie, does this resonate with you guys?
Yes, it certainly does for me. 2020 was a lonely year for sure. But now that things are starting to open up, I find that I'm kind of out of practice socially. Mm-hmm. And, some relationships maybe are stronger because of the pandemic, but a lot of others maybe have kind of fallen off. Right. And I kind of don't know what to do with those. And I just find myself a little reluctant to get back out there because I can easily say, I could just stay home and watch TV. That worked for 12 months. Mm-hmm. So why not just kind of keep going that route? Mm-hmm. But I don't want to. I don't want to. There's a tension there.
Yeah.
Yes. This 100% resonates with me deeply because we recorded our episode and I talked about when Bryce got downsized. We chose to move to a place to be with near our friends because we said we can look for a job anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so we literally moved for our friends. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I was so tired of being isolated in a place. And yes, you long for those people.
Right. And it seems like in midlife, we'd have this down pat. But listeners, lucky for us, we do have a guest here today to help all of us with this. And some of you listeners may have listened to her podcast or heard her on her previous podcast, Sorta Awesome, but we are welcoming Laura Tremaine of the hit podcast, 10 Things to Tell You. She's joining us today to talk about reconnecting with old friends and making new ones. Laura, welcome to Midlife Matters.
I am so happy to be here and to talk about this topic. I think it's so important. Thank you, ladies, for having me.
Yes. And you recently wrote a book centered around today's topic. I mean, it was almost like you probably started this before the pandemic, but it was almost like it was made to come out at the end of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And your whole book is about friendships and sharing your stuff. Can you tell us about your book and why you wrote it?
So the book is called Share Your Stuff, I'll Go First. And that idea came from my years on the internet, sharing myself on blogging, on social media, on the podcast, all of those things that I started doing originally with my mommy blog. I started from a place of loneliness. Like I was a new mom. I was staying at home for the first time when I had worked for a decade previously. And I sort of felt like I didn't know my people here in Los Angeles. I was deeply lonely. I had a lot of hometown friends. I had childhood friends or college friends. But here in my local space in LA, I was super, super lonely. I did not have the kind of girlfriend connection that I was used to when I was younger or that, they write about in books or that you see in movies. I didn't have that. And so I started sharing myself on the internet. What happened pretty quickly when I started sharing myself online, again, this was 10, 11 years ago in blogging heyday, is that it did alleviate my loneliness. I started to realize that people reading and commenting on the things that I was sharing was sort of the key to making the type of friendships that I needed in this day and age. It wasn't going to be the same as when I was in high school in the 90s. It wasn't going to be the same when I was in a sorority in college and we all lived in the same space. In adulthood and in parenthood, life just looks different. And I was going to have to make the effort to share myself. So the internet is the best tool for this. As blogging changed and then social media sort of became very popular. So you didn't have to be a blogger. You didn't have to be a professional writer. Everybody could share their stuff on social media, right? It very quickly became to me obvious that there were women who were on social media. Everybody had a Facebook account and then eventually an Instagram account but they weren't sharing themselves. They were watching other people share themselves and just getting lonelier and lonelier. And so there was this explosion of articles. I'm sure you've seen like, oh, everyone's connected and everyone's more lonely than ever. And I just started to be like, it's because you're not actually sharing. You're just scrolling. Right. And you have to be the person that puts yourself out there. You don't have to be sharing your dirty laundry. You don't have to be like sharing your every second of the day, but you do have to like make that step to share yourself. And if you're not an online person, I realize I just made like this whole story about being online because that's my story. It doesn't have to be online. This translates exactly to your real life friendships too. If you're not sharing yourself in your social circles, if you're just standing there at carpool pickup, if you're just sitting there at girls' night out and listening and never sharing yourself, you are going to feel empty at the end of that dinner. You're going to feel not connected and not understand why. And so I wrote a whole book about like sharing your stuff and how you can share it and what types of things to share. Like I gave questions, I gave examples, I told my own stories in order to feel more connected, because I think in middle life, that's a lot of us, that's what we're lacking.
This is such a great topic. Kind of mentioned being vulnerable is part of this and seems to be the key to kind of good friendships, good conversation. Why is it so hard for us to be vulnerable?
Well, everyone's like vulnerability scale is different. Like what I share, sometimes people think is so brave and vulnerable, and it wasn't for me because that is something I'm comfortable talking about. So everyone like has a different vulnerability scale. But probably if this topic is resonating with you, if you are feeling not so connected to the people in your life, or you don't even have people to feel connected to, then probably you have a fear of vulnerability. But you have to be able to share something of yourself. So it doesn't mean that you have to like start with your childhood trauma. Obviously, that would be very vulnerable for everyone. Sometimes just sharing like, hey, I'm not feeling great this week. Right. That is a baby step for someone, that is like a really big thing to say because they're pretty, invested in always looking like everything's perfect and fine and they feel great. And so just saying like, I don't feel great this week, is vulnerability for them. And then for some people, the scale is different. Like it is like saying, hey, my marriage is in trouble. Hey, I'm struggling at work. Like, it's different. But I really do think that it requires you sharing your stuff. It requires you saying something beyond like chit chat, beyond like, hey, I'm doing fine. Everything's great. You have to go beyond that. And you think you can. I think that we sometimes think, maybe because we learned this lesson in early life, that friendship will just show up at our door. Because a lot of us, when we were younger, it did. You had neighbor kids, you were in school with kids for years, you were in sports, you were in Girl Scouts, whatever, it doesn't matter. We were all sort of handed our friendships when we were young, right? A lot of us. And so we never really had to like flex that muscle of saying, let's be friends. It's not that nobody taught us that. It's just that we never had to do it that often for most of us. I feel like a lot of us have the story of where we had built-in friends. Maybe we had siblings that were our same age. So we don't even understand like the literal how to do this. And so that's why I wanted to say, well, this is how you do it. You have to share yourself. I mean, you have to say hello. You have to start a conversation that involves you sharing something about yourself.
Well, I'm sure part of the difficulty of being vulnerable is fearing, like of getting hurt or rejected. Like there are risks to sharing your stuff. So how do you weigh the benefit versus the risk? Like I know in your book you said, why ruin a perfectly good evening with tears? Like you might just feel like, oh, do we really need to go there? How do you know when that's appropriate?
Well, it's like trial and error because listen, I have ruined a perfectly good evening with tears. But I've also, like I said, come home from a perfectly fine and lovely evening and felt pretty empty and felt like it was a waste of a few hours, a waste of dinner money because it was just very whatevs. And in most cases, I feel like the risk of maybe not crying, maybe not taking it to tears, but the risk of saying, hey, like, let's talk about something else this time instead of maybe you get together with your girlfriends and you always end up talking about your kids for the whole time you're together. Be like, no kids tonight. Like, we are going to talk about ourselves. We're going to talk about how we're feeling. We're going to talk about what we're reading, what we're watching. Like, we're going to talk about something else. And that, again, does not have to necessarily be vulnerable. It's just a reroute into something that's going to make you feel like more connected, because talking about your kids, moaning about your spouses, like some of those topics, like, they get really old. And sometimes you're like, can somebody just please tell me their skincare routine? I just I hate my skin right now. So that's not sharing your deepest self, but that is asking, like, can we just talk about our skin woes instead of this, we always moan about the school PTA or whatever, like, just kind of rerouting in a way that you are going to end up after this interaction with a friend or a group of friends where you're going to feel a little more seen. You're going to feel like you saw someone else in their time. It doesn't always have to end in tears. Now, I do like a good deep conversation. Doesn't always call for tears, but I really love it when people share something about themselves that they don't normally talk about. Here we are in middle life. There's usually decades and decades before us that we don't know anything about. A friend said to me recently, a new friend, and by new, I mean, I've known her for 5 years, but like a newish friend. She said something about her teenage life, her teenage years. And I was like, what? Well, of course I didn't know her in teenage life. How would I ever know that story or know that fact unless she shared it? But it totally like illuminated a part of her personality and sort of a part of her family dynamic that I was like, that is fascinating. But I would have never known that. I didn't meet her till we were in our 40s. Like, I would have never known it if she hadn't shared it. And so those are the type of things that I'm trying to get people, women in particular, to share more about, like, their first loves, their prom date, what subject they excelled in school. Like, I have a friend she's a stay-at-home mom. She's super smart. She's funny. Who would have known that she was a math whiz when she was young? I would have never known that if she hadn't have said it. And I think we kind of get past some of those things where we feel like, well, I mean, like, I'm really going to bring up like mathletes from the 80s. Like, I'm not going to bring that up. We think we shouldn't bring that up. But like, think of your friend group. If you knew that about someone, you'd be like, oh my God, I actually find that really fascinating, right? So the things about ourselves, we can also share that are older or like completely obscure. Like, maybe you are up at night watching random YouTube videos and you've never really told anybody because maybe you think it's weird, or like maybe you don't think it's that interesting. I promise you, these little tidbits about ourselves, they're so much more interesting than like the surface stuff that we all kind of get tired of.
Oh, and
I think as moms, we kind of forget who we were back then. Like, we've forgotten, we've kind of lost touch with that person that we were. And it's easy to think people don't want to know about that, but that is exactly what you enjoy, learning about someone new. So.
Yeah, and your book is great for that because you actually have chapters where you ask questions like, what are you afraid of? Or when did you belong? And you could even get together with your friends and just say, like you said, hey, instead of talking about what we usually talk about, let's bring up this question and everybody have an answer. And you'd come away knowing something.
That's my favorite way to do like a girls' night out, or if you're doing a weekend away with friends, when we're allowed to do that again. And, things like that. Like, I don't mind the surface chit chat for a little bit. I don't mind everybody venting about what they need to get off their chest, like sort of the normal thing we always do. But also, I like to say, all right, we're going to go around and we're going to share one thing right now. We're going to share something we're looking forward to. We're going to share our greatest joy, our greatest struggle. We're going to share what our favorite beauty trend or like fashion trend is right now. Anything. It doesn't matter. Again, pick your vulnerability scale, read the room on what your audience will sort of respond to, because everybody's friend groups or even individual relationships are different. But you don't have to take over the whole meal or time together with this thing, but just like a reroute with just 10, 15, 30 minutes of being like, let's just do this thing.
Right.
And then we can get back to our regular rhythms.
Yeah.
You will totally come away feeling like, I don't know, there's like a love for humanity.
Right.
You know, when you do that kind of thing of like,
Yeah.
yes, we're all the same and different, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I would imagine once you get down that path, you probably wouldn't want to go back to the superficial, shallow stuff. Once you kind of break the ice and get into that deeper conversation, that's where you'll want to stay.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you do have something, hard to share. How do you decide who the safe people are?
God, this is also an answer that's trial and error. But you know what I think is more important in some ways than who the safe people are? Because that has a million factors to it. We all have to learn to trust our intuition. There's a lot going on. Like someone who you might trust in one area, you might talk to them about parenting, but you wouldn't talk to them about finances. You know what I mean? Like there's just like so many factors in our friendships for all kinds of different ways. But a really important aspect of that question is, when do you share something hard or vulnerable? Because I think this is where women can get it wrong and feel very unseen, or it changes their friendships forever. And it's because they brought this up at the football game, or they brought this up with toddlers crawling along their feet, and somebody is inevitably going to need to go in the other room and change a diaper.
Mm-hmm.
They brought this up in the car where everyone was stuck and it got awkward fast. I mean, I don't know. There are scenarios in which you have to be able to know the timing. I really feel like the timing here, and I've messed this up 6 ways to Sunday. So I'm speaking this from experience where I have ended up feeling like, oh my gosh, I said the most awkward thing and now our relationship has changed forever. Or I said something really hard and they didn't respond in a way I was hopeful they would respond. I've been on the receiving end where somebody said something really hard and I was not in a space to respond to them appropriately. And maybe I was clueless about it, or maybe I realized it and just could not right that ship. The timing on sharing yourself in the most vulnerable ways is just really important. Either depending on how important the thing is that you're sharing, set aside a time that you're sort of prepping the receiver of, I'm about to say something really hard. Or I need you to listen and not fix this for me. Or I'm ready to listen to something that you have to share. And I have prepared my heart to be non-judgmental, like I am relaxed. I have turned my phone off. Or in a group of friends, like to sort of prep on the group text before you get together, like, hey, tonight we're going to talk about this. Some people need to bow out, frankly. Some people want to prepare themselves so that they don't act appropriate or inappropriate. You know what I mean? Like just set yourself up and your friend group up and your relationships up for success. Don't bring it up when, don't drop a bomb over margaritas when everyone else has like their party hats on. Like it's going to change the night. It's going to make you feel bad. You're going to end up crying for all the wrong reasons, And I've learned this with my husband. I've learned this with my sister. I've learned this with friends. Like this is sort of just a thing that we all have to learn in relationship, and we're not always going to get it right. Also, if you're the one who's sharing, give yourself some time to prepare to sort of release your expectations on how they're going to receive it, right? So you can't control how they receive it. Maybe they laugh. Maybe they dismiss it and like, oh, you're fine. Like, it doesn't sound like that big a deal. When they do that, if you have sort of prepared yourself for sharing something hard, it doesn't mean that you can't note like, oh, hey, that wasn't what I was expecting she was going to say, or that was unhelpful, or, okay, well, this friend is not that friend to me. Noted. It doesn't mean that you can't note it, but don't break your own heart over it. Kind of prepare yourself to, I'm going to release as much as possible, because this is so much easier said than done. I'm going to release how they receive this. And if they nail it on a friendship level, great. But if they don't, I'm still going to love her. She's still going to love me. And we will just go forward with new knowledge about one another. So it's really about just paying attention and not sharing yourself haphazardly. So while I am talking about sharing yourself online, sharing yourself at Girls Night Out, like I'm all about sharing yourself, do not do it without thought. Because that's when we kind of get wrecked of like, okay, I've just now, because I've had 2 margaritas, I'm going to say this really hard thing. you haven't really prepped yourself or the person you're talking to, right? Like you've just gotten liquid courage.
Right.
That's not prep. That's not prep, you know?
And I'm thinking, what happens, like, what does oversharing look like? Because we maybe even go into it prepared. And then when we walk away, we're like, oh, I said too much. Like, what does oversharing look like? And maybe how can we avoid it?
So ladies, I've decided something since I've written this book and have been talking about it for a year now. I no longer believe in oversharing.
Oh, that's a bold statement.
It is. It's a bold statement, but I really mean it, and I've thought about it a lot. Now, I think that there are people who don't share to our taste. You know, if they share too much, if they give too many details. Think of who you know that you think overshares, because we all have people that we're like, okay, she doesn't share the way like that I like, either online or in person, like not to my taste. But I no longer want to talk about like what women should or shouldn't do in the frame of oversharing, because outside of like, obviously, if you're sharing is harmful to someone else, then that's like sort of a different deal. If you're harming someone's livelihood or their job or their, you know, if you're telling someone else's secrets, right, that is oversharing. But for yourself, think of the people you know who overshare. Just picture this person for a second. Think for a second, is she really lonely? This is why she shares once an hour on Facebook, because she doesn't have anyone in her real life that's listening to her. Let's just be honest. Okay. Is she oversharing because she never learned in her childhood, like social cues necessarily of like what, you know, maybe the way that she grew up was different than the way you grew up. And so she just like spills it all out because that's what she was taught, or no one told her to put on the brakes there. Okay. That's a way of oversharing, but it's also a way that she's sharing herself, you know, again, not to your taste. Another example of this is a person who takes up a lot of space in the room. So the one who talks too much, the one who takes over the conversation, and like it's sort of exhausting for other people. We all have this friend, right? We just do. What is she doing that she does that? Like, is she projecting overconfidence because she's really insecure? Has she learned humor as a coping mechanism, and she's used to being like the class clown? I just want us to have a little bit more compassion for women who quote unquote overshare and why they're doing it. I'm not telling you have to like it. I'm not telling you that you have to stay Facebook friends with them. If they like share all the time and it drives you bananas, unfollow them, unfriend them. But I think I don't want to talk anymore about oversharing as a way of silencing the way that women are sharing themselves, because there's always a why behind why they share that way. And I just want to reframe how we talk about oversharing, because it's not only a form of judgment, which we all judge one another, fine.
Right. It's
also a form of like silencing. I feel like she should be quieter. She should be smaller because it what affects me? No. But then think of all the people you know. You probably know one. You could probably come up with less than 5 people that came to your mind when you thought of oversharing, versus the hundreds of acquaintances we all know or that share online. And to me, that one person that overshares either the details or the frequency with which that she shares, that one person has affected all these other people who are like, oh, well, I'm not going to share because I don't want to be seen like Sally, because we all know that everyone talks about Sally behind her back and how much she shares. That keeps me from sharing because of the one person who shares a lot. And that's what I hate about it also, is that we have looked at ourselves in comparison to other people and been like, well, I'm not going to share because people might think that I'm oversharing, or I've heard everybody snark about Sally, so I don't want to be snarked about. So I'm not going to share this thing that I really, really want to share, but I'm not going to. So we have not only wished to silence Sally, we have also taken on our own, like, I don't know what you call it, policing, share policing in a whole community or social setting. And I hate that. I hate that we would look at the overshare as the standard, when we know statistically we can only think of a couple of overshares. Most people are not oversharing like that.
Yeah, most people aren't sharing at all.
Right. Most people aren't sharing at all. And so, like, when we talk too much about oversharing, It's just so statistically a small amount of people who are actually over. It's such a small amount of people, truly.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I would love to kind of shift and get your thoughts on this next topic, but there's a lot of women in midlife that find themselves in new situations. They've had major life changes. They've moved, they've gotten divorced, they've had a death of a spouse, they're an empty nest. I'd love to talk about how to make new friends, also growing and maintaining your essentially old friends. What advice would you give us?
Making new friends is hard for me. I mean, I shared on the internet for a long time. I still didn't have a lot of local Los Angeles friends. So if the original problem was I didn't have a lot of local friends, I made friends on the internet. I still didn't have a lot of local friends. Like, it is still hard for me. I mean, what changed in my life was we got involved in a community. So my kids started a school that had a really active parent community. And so that was what was helpful to me. I mean, you can join a church, you can join a club, like there's other ways, but I really think that it is easiest for most busy, thoughtful adults to have some kind of umbrella of something that is sort of dictating a social schedule or makes you have something in common with others. It is like a part-time job to try and maintain just individual relationships without that umbrella structure, right? So like a school, a church, or whatever, they have certain events that you have to be at on a regular basis. And so therefore you see people. And it doesn't mean you don't make social plans outside of that, but you know you're going to see them a couple of times a month, at least with this sort of umbrella structure. That does the work for you. If you're trying to do it all yourself, like just maintaining friendships, I mean, that's literally like a job. I mean, I don't even know. That would be like way too hard for me. I have to have a thing of like, well, I'm going to see her next week at the thing and we will talk and then maybe we'll make a coffee date after that. But like, I cannot be responsible for the entire social calendar for every person I know and that I want to know better. It's just too hard.
Well, something that you just said, Laura, is that you maybe will make an individual coffee date. Because I think sometimes we're in those organizations and it never moves beyond that. So maybe not like how do we make just a brand new friend, but like how do you make a true friend out of a group that you're already in?
Again, for me, it ties to the thing. So I know not everyone's a mother. And so I know that this is not like always a perfect example, but this is just from my own life. Can we go get coffee after carpool? Like we're both going to be there anyway. Can you get breakfast there? For most people's schedules, it's easier to tie it to the thing you're already doing. We have a meeting at church on Wednesday. Let's go grab a bite to eat after. And then I think those things kind of tie. You know, we have a sporting event that we're all at on Saturday. Can we go to the beach when we're done? Whatever. Like it's people's schedules and like busyness. It's a whole other podcast episode, ladies. But like busyness is something we're all afflicted with. Even in pandemic times, I feel like we all have these obligations. We have social obligations. We have work obligations, family obligations, all these things that I'm an easier yes. If someone's asking me, it's an easier yes for me if it's tied to something already happening versus like, can you get together on Thursday the 12th? I'm like, well, I have no idea. Can I? Like, I mean, maybe. Right. And then once a friendship starts going, I think it takes maybe 5 to 7 times of these sort of like contrived things, like real effortful things. And then I think that the ball sort of rolls a little bit easier. But I do like to tie it to something already existing. Now, if you're making a new friend, maybe you made a new friend on the internet and you don't necessarily have an umbrella thing that's keeping you in common and you really do have to be a bit more effortful, then I just think technology is our friend. Texting apps. I love the Voxer app for keeping in touch, Marco Polo's Words with Friends or whatever, like sometimes let the app do some of the heavy lifting for keeping you in touch. There's just a lot of other ways that I think we take on this big burden of, yes, it takes some intention, takes some effort. But if it's going to be, if making a new friend is going to be like, again, a part-time job, a side hustle, well, we're not going to do it. We don't have too much going on. You have to make it easy on yourself in some ways, so that's why tie it to an event that's already happening, tie it to an app you're already using. Hey, I play Words with Friends. Do you? A book club, anything like that.
Yeah. Well, I have a contrived scenario I want to run by you.
Okay.
We have lived in our house for 22 years, so we've seen most of our neighbors kind of come and go. But we're still here, so I have all new neighbors, and I really want to get to know them. So next week, I've planned a little fire pit night for some of the ladies, and I really don't know them at all. So I know we've talked about how to ask good questions, but what kind of things make up a good question? Like
First of all, I love your fire pit night so much. I think that's amazing. And that's you doing the brave thing right there, is hosting the fire pit night.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
I mean, I want to be invited to a fire pit night, but it's hard to be the host. Like, a lot of times we want the invitation, but the hosting is the heavy lifting.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of responsibility. Like, what if it doesn't go well? What if we only get to superficial conversation? And so I don't know. Help me think about how to make this a success.
Well, I don't think you should go too deep on a first night with neighbors that you do not know very well.
Tears.
And you do not, no tears. Try and not cry.
You will be seeing them all the time. So
yeah. So don't be like, what's your biggest struggle right now? Like, maybe that's just not, people are going to be like, I have to go.
I know.
I like to start with something like light and fun. I don't know why prom always comes to mind. And listen, prom might be a trigger for some people if they didn't go to prom. So tread lightly.
It is prom season.
But it is prom season. So like if you have a sense that maybe everyone graduated from high school, I'm just throwing this out there, I don't know, then maybe what was your graduation like? Like, did you do a senior thing? Did you have senioritis? Like, just bring up something that can be light. Now listen, that topic can be revealing. Someone might say something totally crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Or they might say something hard. They might say something really hard to me happened my senior year. I don't know. Be prepared to go with the flow. But I like to start with something that we probably all have in common. Let's just say high school graduation. It is graduation season.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they're new to the neighborhood, because you said you've had a lot of turnover, be like, what in your last neighborhood, did you know your neighbors? Did you do something like this in your last neighborhood? What neighborhoods have you enjoyed living in?
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you a little bit about that. Make it about the neighbor things. Like, can we exchange numbers for emergency contact reasons? That's not a necessarily deep question, but it does foster a connection, right? Like, okay, I'm having your back. I'm asking for your number and I'm receiving your number because I expect that we are neighbors. Like, I'm setting the tone for this neighborliness.
Mm-hmm.
It starts with listening, which is hard when you're hosting, by the way. Like, hosting at your home, you're trying to think about the food and
are people having a good time?
Yeah, is there enough drinks? Did the dog get out? I don't know. You're thinking of a lot of things. But try and listen to people. If a conversation's sort of sparking over here with these three people and they're talking about a new store that opened downtown, just keep your ears perked up to listen of where do you guys like to shop? Are you an online shopper? Do you prefer boutiques? Do you like department stores? I just listen. And when I hear a word or a topic that comes up, especially on the lighter side, because the harder stuff, kind of a whole different animal sometimes, right? But when you're at a social event like this, to just listen for one keyword or one sort of key topic and then roll with it. And it just treat it like a game for yourself. You're not telling everyone else, this is what you're doing. You're what 3 questions can I ask around shopping that will get us talking? Well, then once they start talking about shopping and then someone says, oh, I only will go into the Lululemon store. That's my favorite place to shop. Okay, well, this person likes to work out or they like yoga. Maybe, probably. So then you'd be like, oh, do you, and then you ask. It's like an art of conversation, which of course I haven't nailed and no one has, but it starts with listening. Yeah. It's so much easier to listen for the keywords than it is to come in with a set of questions okay, I'm going to ask them about this and I'm going to ask them about this, ask about this. Because what if you have a plan and what if, Lord have mercy, this happens. You go in with your lighthearted plan and then someone's like, I lost someone to COVID this year. And now we've gone deep real fast and we were not anticipating that. We had a lighthearted plan. So
it's hard to talk about yoga pants after that.
Right. You're like, oh God. I thought we were going to talk about Lululemon. Okay. Well, you have to be able to sort of listen and roll with it. Maybe pay attention to the whole room as the host of oh gosh, this neighbor is not feeling it. She's crossed her arms. She's very uncomfortable. You want to have compassion for the person who's talking about their loss because we've all had a very difficult year, but you also have to sort of accommodate everybody and like sort of be and maybe gently move it to a place where everyone can participate in the conversation. I feel like I'm giving you a lot of to-dos and it's not as hard as I'm saying it.
Right.
No, listening is definitely the key, I think. And that's hard because as the host, oftentimes you're just thinking, what can I say next? And you're not listening because you're thinking about your next thing to say.
Yeah. If I'm meeting with neighbors, I would have a few things that I genuinely want to know. So not like, you picked it out of a hat or you Googled it, but like, these are new neighbors. I genuinely want to know where their favorite places in town to eat. Like, I actually want to know, like, we're neighbors. So how do we capitalize on our neighborness? I would want to talk about a lot of local stuff.
Yeah.
Or, if they've moved in, like maybe home decor stuff or home renovation stuff, that kind of thing, because what you have in common is homes, location. You're all going to have to eat in town. You're all going to, that kind of thing that is interesting to everyone. Like I will talk about where we should all eat in any neighborhood I'm in. You know what I mean? And it's not offensive to anyone. You haven't waded into politics or religion.
Yeah. It's always fun to share your favorite new restaurant, and most people are eager to find that out. So
that's right. And then I'm not sure about your community, but like maybe something about the schools if there's a lot of parents in the group, maybe something about the churches if you think that might hit with this group or not, whatever. But like, you don't know exactly what you're going to have in common, but you know that you have the street in common.
Right.
Well, listeners might be thinking, well, she mentioned busyness before, and then this seems like a lot of work to have a gathering. I think like it can feel like a lot of work to have friends, and sometimes we just don't think that we have the time to put in, Laura. So what is the point of making these friendships a priority? Because maybe some people need that little impetus, like what will you get out of it if you put the time in?
Listen, I know it's so hard to make time for one more thing, to think about hosting another event, to think about what you're going to talk about at the event. Like it's all a lot on our plates that are already very full. But I think what happens with a lot of women is we spend a good chunk of the early part of our middle life really into our families or our careers or whatever our life looks like. And maybe we have holdover friends from our 20s, or we're thinking, oh, I'll have time to take walks with my friends when I'm an empty nester. We have this way that we think it's going to go. But what I have looked around and seen on my podcast and then writing this book is that women in their 40s, so they have bigger kids, they no longer have babies, they're no longer empty nesters. Maybe they've gone through a divorce, so maybe they don't have a spouse, or they were single and never married. They are lonely. We are lonely. And so it is worth putting in the time so that you don't get to middle life. We're already here. You don't get further into middle life without companionship. And we just look up and we're like, nobody knows me. I just had my head down, like doing my stuff. And it's been good stuff. And I will never regret the time that I put into my work or my family. But also, it's not the only thing. And one of the reasons that we don't share in this same time period that I'm describing, when we're just head down doing the work of family and work and life and home ownership and like all the things, is that we are often protecting something else. So we don't share because we feel like we're a reflection on our kids, we're a reflection on our spouse, we're a reflection on our work. And, that's partially true. Depending on what kind of job you have, you probably you're not supposed to share certain things on the internet or whatever. These are valid considerations that we have. But what ends up happening is we protect these other things to such an extent that we sort of whitewash ourselves. And we get there and we're like, oh my gosh, I have just projected, not on purpose, I didn't set out to do this, but I've sort of projected blandness, perfection, everything's fine. I am only interested in the pop culture that everyone's interested in. I have middle of the road political beliefs. I believe the same thing about God that everybody in my community believes about God. Like we have ended up in middle life being like, oh, none of that's actually true. We all have individual beliefs and thoughts and opinions and things that we're interested in, but we've whitewashed it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like we've made ourselves so bland and so pleasing to our community, to our social circle, because we don't want to cause any waves. We don't want to be snarked about. We don't want to be different. We want to fit in. We want to belong. All of those things are important. There's nothing wrong. Like our intentions are good in that way to want to fit in. Our intentions are good to want to protect people outside of ourselves. But there's definitely like a threshold that we cross to then getting down the road and being like, oh, I'm just like the most boring person. People will say this to me. They say this to me on my podcast. They say this to me when they read my book. They'll be like, but I don't have these stories that you're sharing about your life. Like my life is really boring. And I'm like, first of all, I don't think that's probably true. But if it is, what have you participated in that dynamic of making it so boring? And I don't say that in a shaming way, but if you're going to come at me with, I'm boring, I'm going to respond with, well, what is that about?
Right. And you probably aren't boring, but I do think that, especially in midlife, as your kids get older and they shame you for anything outside of complete normalcy or conformity.
Yeah.
They don't want you sharing one thing. And then, like you said, if your husband has a job where you feel like you have to take a step back on social media, or if you feel like, I don't know, it can be very easy to whitewash yourself. Mindy, you're nodding. Do you feel like you've done that?
Oh, I just feel like you have to, you're not being sincere. First of all, I have so many thoughts because you have to have wisdom about who you share these things with and in the place and in the time. Like Laura said, people can tell if you're being genuine and sincere. And those relationships where you're trying to get to know somebody, so say the other person isn't open, you kind of like, okay, well, that door's shut. Like, she didn't really care to get to know me. Because it's not a real friendship unless you're willing to be sincere and genuine. So it just takes so much navigating, kind of, having wisdom and like, who should you share what with and when and how and, and all of these things. So,
yeah. And I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, like when you have teenagers, their stories aren't really yours to share, so you do isolate and you're quiet. And then when they leave home, you want to share all this stuff and then you don't have anybody to share it with, like it's going to take work and you can just get into a rut, where you don't know what to do next. But I've learned that if I'm not going to be willing to put the attention into a friendship, I have to ask myself if I'm prepared for the consequences of that neglect. I am going to be lonely and just have to step up and get out there.
I feel like I've given like a ton of to-dos and you should and all of that. That's not my heart behind this. Like for people who are listening, I mean, yes, we've talked about a ton of aspects of this, like different angles of it and how you can think about it and what you could do and like whatever. But I think if you're listening and if you just take one thing from this conversation of like, and whatever thing it is for you that sort of pinged your heart of like, oh, I could do that. I could host a fire pit night, or no, wait, that's way too much work for me. I could ask someone for coffee after soccer. Like just one thing as you're listening to a conversation like this that has a ton of layers and a ton of angles, and everyone has different vulnerability scales and everyone has different loneliness scales. Like to just hear sort of the heart behind what we're all saying of connection, right? Of like, I want all of us to feel connected and seen. And I want us to be in relationships where we feel like we can share ourselves. I want us to feel like the freedom and the non-shame to share ourselves online. But I just don't want anyone to like press close at the end of this conversation and feel like really overwhelmed by the to-dos of it, because that's not like the heart here. The heart is for us all to feel in the middle of our life connected and whole and seen and not whitewashed and not shamed for saying who we are, sharing who we are. There's a lot of ways to do it, which is why there's a lot of ways to talk about it. But most of us just need one baby step.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe it sounds like a negative question, but there are different seasons that we go through in life. Seasons, age of kids, being married, not married, stages. And so we naturally will gravitate towards different friends at different seasons. I have found that in different seasons, there's different things I can get from someone in that same season, or you gravitate towards a different person. It seems a little selfishly motivated though. And I want to get your thoughts on this because is that okay?
So my knee-jerk reaction, and what I probably would have said on most other days, is yes, of course. I have friends that I was only friends with when they had babies. And then once the kids got a little older, we really didn't have a lot in common. They sort of faded out. So my knee-jerk is yes, and I think we all have those. Here's my big caveat to this that I think we learned in the pandemic more than ever is I have heard just recently, so this is tip top of my mind, I've heard recently from friends who were single or who didn't have children, and their experience in quarantine in the pandemic was so different from mine, who I complained every day because I'm an introvert and I had to be stuck in this house with my husband and children for a full year. And that's like funny, haha, because introvert in quarantine with others is like funny, haha. If I could go back and do this last year, I would have made much more intentional effort towards my friends who were at home alone for a year. And so in that case, I know that's not exactly what you were asking, but like not everyone is in that same season I am, and they need something. They needed something from me that I had to give, and I didn't give it. Now, I didn't withhold it selfishly. Like I wasn't like I refused to reach out to my single friends. I just was on my own hamster wheel of introvertedness, right? So I think all of us have good intentions and all of us are doing the best we can. So while I also, like you, sort of tend to prioritize the people who are kind of right along with me. You know what I mean? Like I'm going to prioritize the volleyball moms right now because my kids in volleyball twice a week and it's just like all we all think about. So like, yes, they're sort of on the most top of my mind right now. They're my top text threads, if you will. And that might not always be true, but that's true for these years that we're in, right? Of volleyball.
Right.
But I don't think that's a pass. And I'm talking to myself when I say this. I don't think that's a pass for the people who are not in it with us, who are not in the same season, to just be like, yeah, all I can handle right now is the volleyball moms. Some days I say that to myself, and some days that's true. But in a bigger picture way, in a week and in a month, that's not community. And that doesn't serve the people who, I promise you, they feel it that I have left them behind for the volleyball moms. Because they don't have kids at all, or they're not in volleyball, their kid's not sporty. And so they feel dropped, if you will, or neglected when we had a real connection, when we were having our thing in common, you know? Now, it doesn't mean that every friend that you've collected along the way in the different seasons, they don't all have the same priority. They don't all have the same attention that needed to be paid to them, and friends can fade in and out of our lives. But now that I'm a little bit older, because I think there are seasons where sometimes you do get a pass. You get a pass on all the things during the baby years. You get a pass on all the things if you're going through a season of grief. There are times where you do get a pass. But in just regular old life, because I've just been told this in the last few weeks, like I missed an opportunity to show love to people who were having a different pandemic experience than I was. And because they weren't in my exact same season. And I want to do better on that going forward.
I appreciate your words so much on that, because anyone that, really felt isolated realizes the value of having any friend. Like all people are valuable and worthwhile. And so I thank you so much for being open about your thoughts on that.
And I've found, being in my 40s now, that I regret some of the friends that I let go in the busier times where I thought I can't handle anything more. But then your thoughts go back to them and you think, oh, I really did have a great connection. But then you don't know if you should reach back out. But I would almost say to listeners, maybe reach back out. Like, I think a lot of us get to midlife and we're like, oh, that mom I knew 15 years ago, actually, I really still miss her.
Yeah, totally. And you don't have to do a whole big, like, sit down, like you're, let's rehash why our friendship faded. It doesn't have to be that way. Sometimes we make it so hard. Women, especially, we make it so hard emotionally.
Right.
When, like, think if you were a man, you'd just be like, hey, dude, I kind of miss hanging out. Let's hang out. If we do our version of that, which is like, hey, I've thought about you so often over the last few years. My life is different than when we were friends. And I was wondering if you have any space for me to grab a coffee or, whatever. Like I have so many great memories with you. Are you around? Don't make it like this whole bit, you don't have to have a whole big thing.
And apologize and explain.
Yeah, don't. Like, we're all grown-ups. We all have seasons. I think most of us get it. We're not so high maintenance that we require this whole big thing, but we think the other person is going to require it, or we think that's like what's appropriate, or like, I don't know, whatever we think. We get so in our head about it. Instead of just keeping it so simple to be like, hey, I was thinking about you. I miss you. It's been a while. Are you around? Like, that's it.
That's great.
Yeah. Who wouldn't say yes to that?
I know.
Right.
Yeah. So this is kind of tied into what we just talked about, but when do you know it's time to let a friendship go and why?
Oh, y'all, this is so hard. And like, I know there's so much pain behind this question. I get a lot of messages of people who have been broken up with by a friend. That it is very painful for people. It is like, akin to, it is definitely a cousin to a divorce or something like that. It can be very, very painful to have a friend break up with you for all the reasons that any kind of rejection or relationship hurts, of where, you think, what did I do? Even if you recognize that the relationship was toxic or hard or maybe needed to be let go of, it's still like, gosh, there was a person here in my life and now they're not in my life. And so it's hard to recognize when you need to let a friend go, and it's hard to be broken up with. I have been on all sides of this equation, and I can attest that it is hard for all the ways. Your question specifically was, how do you know when it's time for you to let a friend go, which is different than when someone lets you go and you have maybe less control over. I do think women, in the same way that we don't reach out to friends that we or people that we used to have a connection with, but that's sort of faded. In the same way that we don't reach out to those people because we get all in our head about it, we also hesitate to let current people in our life that need to go. We're like, oh, that seems like a whole drama. But that person is sucking the life out of our time. They're texting us 10 times a day, or when we talk, it's very negative. They talk a lot about other people in a way that makes us uncomfortable. They've insulted our spouse. They've like posted, you have this person, right, where you're like, awful. I mean, maybe it's just me. I don't know. Or they've like really posted some cuckoo bananas things on social media, and we're like, oh no. I do not know what to do. Like, we have these people that were like, I do not know that we need to continue being such good friends. I just try to, I don't know how woo-woo y'all go or not, but I try to pay a lot of attention to my body when I'm with people. Your body will tell you everything you need to know. Your body, okay? You have to pay attention to your body. Pay attention to your subconscious body language. If you angle away from someone, if you lean back to someone as they yell at you, some people yell talk. Pay attention to if you feel like a fullness of, like a happiness, a fulfillment when you leave an interaction with them, or if you feel your posture is depleted. Pay attention to how you feel when it comes up on your phone that a text is coming through from them. Now, this is a lot of mindfulness I'm talking about. I'm like, I don't go through my day paying attention to my body every time a text comes through. This is not what I'm saying. But if you have had the thought, I'm hesitant on this person, something doesn't feel right. Once you have that first thought, then is when you need to start clocking what's happening in your body. Your body will tell you. You might get upset stomach sometimes. Your throat might get really scratchy. I mean, people don't always associate things that happen with their body with the person they're in the room with. And I'm here to tell you, it can very much be associated with the person that you're in the room with. How you hold your posture, what happens if you get a headache. If you just pay attention now, watch, you'll do this. Or, I'm just giving a bunch of negative examples, but like positive examples can happen too. Like I have a friend that just lights me up when she comes into a room. I'm just like so happy to see her because she is joy personified and it is contagious. And so this happens with people who are Eeyores, who are not joy personified. Doesn't mean they don't deserve love, doesn't mean they don't deserve friendship. But you have to pay attention to every time this person is around, I have a headache after. Well, that's not a coincidence, folks.
So if you're talking to someone and they say, you don't have any Advil with you, do you? I mean, you should maybe rethink.
You should be like, did I give you a headache? But actually, all jokes aside, you pay attention to other people's body language around you. Maybe you're the yell talker.
Yeah.
If people are leaning away from you or they're angling their chair the other way, always, without shame and without judgment, look inward and think, what's happening here? Am I like not reading the tone? Am I like, what's happening? And maybe they're not your people and it's as simple as that. Or maybe there's something that you can adjust in the dynamic. We talk a lot about friendships, about how other people need to pull it together. I mean, right? We think about it like that. But what about our own? Are we being too snarky at girls' night out and talking about someone else? Are we yell talking? Like I said, are we taking up so much space in the room in our oversharing? Because maybe the oversharers who are listening to this rejoiced when I said I don't believe in oversharing. But if you realize that possibly what's happening in your friend dynamic is that no one else gets a chance to talk, that's your dynamic. Right?
Well, you have so much good advice, Laura. I've loved talking with you, and I have so much food for thought. And listeners, I want to just urge you to get Laura's book, Share Your Stuff, I'll Go First, because it also gives you so much food for thought about what you could talk about with friends. I was talking with Julie last night, and I was saying, we should take a couple of these chapters and just do a podcast episode amongst the three of us, because we would learn new things, and it would be kind of like a book club, I mean, I think that your book is just awesome for getting women talking about subjects that they probably wouldn't on their own.
Yes, I would love if you did that. My favorite things have been people have brought this to their girls' night out, their women's weekend, their book clubs, and gone around and answered these questions, just a few, that sort of fit your friendship dynamic. And it is like my favorite way for people to read the book. I don't want people to read this book solo. I want them to buy it for their sister. I want them to buy it for their, friend that they're trying to get to know better. And do the book together is really the best way to read this book, I think.
Yeah. And it's not a book you have to read, from the front to the back in order. You can kind of just pick and choose.
Right. Exactly.
Right. And if you want to hear more from Laura, her podcast, 10 Things to Tell You, is awesome. If you want to go to our show notes, we will put links to Laura's book and her podcast and all the things. Is there anything else you want us to put a link to, Laura?
You can find my book or my show, 10 Things to Tell You, or my favorite place on Instagram. My handle is Laura.Tremaine. But you can find all of those things at 10thingstotellyou.com, the number 10 thingstotellyou.com.
Awesome. All right. We'll be sure and put a link in our show notes. Thank you, Laura, for coming on and talking with us today. We enjoyed it so much.
I loved this, ladies. This was super fun. Thanks for having me.
Yes. Thank you for coming on.
Julie and Mindy, we'll talk to you next week.
All right.
Bye, girls.
We're so happy you joined us today. You can find the show notes for this episode at midlifematterspodcast.com. Also, please tell a friend about the show and help them hit the free subscribe button on their favorite podcast app. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Midlife Matters Podcast. That's where we post pictures and stories about all the things we talk about in each episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.